Oh yeah, they were inseparable. After Grandpa sold his farm, they lived together and farmed. First over on a farm east of where we live now. That belonged later on to Hance Larsen, Hance and Mary Larsen. They lived there for I don't know how long, probably a couple of years, because our farm was gone, we no longer owned it. And then they lived where Webbs live now, not in that house, but they lived there. And they dug the basement for the house that's there now, using horses and a scraper, scraper pulled by the horses and dug by hand. And yeah, they were pretty much inseparable. They were partners. They had joint bank accounts and everything else. And they always went to sales together or everything else. Yeah, they were pretty much inseparable. Then later on, Uncle Fred got married, and after a period of time, he bought another farm and moved over there. And Dad stayed where we were. And of course, the grandparents lost their house in town, so they had to come back and live on their farm, which they owned it. And then Grandpa died in 1938, and Grandma lived until 1942. Three of my grandparents died in our house. Grandma Walsh did not. She died over by the house north of Willis. But the other three died in the same room. And then Aunt Mary and Mom were very close too. They did everything together, went shopping together, and if there was a big project, cooking, like thrashers or something like that, that was always a joint project. Another thing they used to do that was an awfully lot of work was canned meat. Because in those days, before electricity, there was no way of keeping meat. So you could butcher an animal and cut it up in little pieces, and usually they do it with a pig. Cut it up in little pieces, fry it, pack it into jars, and then pour liquid lard on top of the jars for a seal, I guess. And then of course they had to seal it, put lids on it, and cook it in what was called a cooker. They had a rack, and they'd put the jars in the rack and cook it in there for quite a long time. I don't know just how long. And then take it out and then hope that it all sealed. And they'd have that, because in the summer you couldn't have fresh meat without a refrigerator. And until electricity came, we didn't have refrigerators. We got electricity in 1942, primarily because they didn't want Grandma Hogh dealing with kerosene lamps. It was dangerous, and certainly it was. So they were able to get electricity. It was during the war, and it was hard to come by, but in those days they would allocate certain resources to farms because food production was very important. If the food production slowed down or was non-existent, then we'd have been in real trouble with armies in Europe and in the Pacific. And of course in Europe there was very little raised because the whole continent was pretty much a battlefield. So in 1942 they strung wires, and I remember watching them put up the transformer. I was only 3 years old, but I do remember them putting up the transformer. I don't actually remember not having electricity, but obviously we didn't. And I guess Mom and Dad were gone to town when they turned it on, and I think Aunt Gertrude was there. And she wanted me to turn the light on when they came, but she couldn't get me to do it. I was 3 years old, so. But anyway, it was certainly a safety boon because those kerosene lamps were dangerous. You could so easily knock one over. And like if you get up at night and have to have a light, you'd have to fumble for the matches and fumble for then raise the chimney on the lamp and light it. And it was really difficult. And I know what I can remember about it is there would be power outages in the winter when the weather was bad. Sometimes we'd be without power for a few days. And a very important project was to get the lamp shades washed and the lamp chimneys washed in the morning, because they'd smoke up at night. Well, you wanted to have them washed before night when you had to light them. So that was always top priority, you know. Right after the breakfast dishes, the lamp chimneys would be washed. Every farm in those days milked cows. We did, so did everybody else, and had what was called a separator, a cream separator. It was a centrifuge. You poured the milk into a large bowl, and then you'd have to turn the crank and get it up to speed. When it wasn't going fast enough, it would ring, an audible ring. Then when it got fast enough, it was no longer an audible ring. It was just a soft. You could still hear it, but it was soft. Well, that meant you could turn on the spigot, 2 spigots, and cream would come out one, and the separated milk would come out the other. Separated milk, of course, had the fat removed. And people sold cream in those days. Milk was too bulky. I know down in Springfield they sold bulk milk, but you couldn't do it here because, well, there was no place would buy it. And even if there had been, the roads were such that a milk truck couldn't get to most of the farms all winter, or for a significant part of the winter, which would have really messed things up. But cream was more compact. There was only a portion of it, so you'd fill the cream can, and sometimes they were taken over to Goodwin and put on the train, the cream can. And then later on, we'd take it into South Sioux. There was a creamery run by a man named Berger, which was in the middle of town. And go in there with the cream can, and they'd dump it and test it, and then they'd wash the can and give it back to you and pay you whatever was due for the cream. And everybody did it. It was everybody around had a cream can. In those days, a lot of people would go to town on Saturday night, the farmers would. The stores in town would usually stay open till sometimes as long as midnight. And the barber shops would be crowded because that's when most of their business was done. They probably did more business on a Saturday night than they do on 2 or 3 weekdays. When in 1926, the Walshes moved to Dakota County to a farm up on top of a hill. It was not a very good farm. It was very hilly and rugged. But Grandpa rented it. They had to leave Dixon County, and I don't know why. If the farm they were on had been sold, they didn't own it. It was rented. It was sold, or if the owners wanted to move back to it, or whatever. But he did find this farm. We always referred to it as the Kearney 80 because it belonged to a man named Edward T. Kearney. He'd been a banker in Jackson. He's buried out in St. John's Cemetery. He was a good man, and then later on he had a bank in Sioux City. And one of the things he used to do every year at Christmas, he'd send money to the local jail for the jailers to buy something for the prisoners. But it was anonymous. He always signed it Mickey Finn. And it was a long time before they knew who it actually was. But it was Edward Thomas Kearney. So we still refer to that land as the Kearney 80. Well, they moved up there, and poor Grandma, she was, as bad as things were up in Dixon County, it was worse when they got down there. Because here she was, a long ways away from another house. There weren't any close neighbors, and it was very remote. And at night the coyotes would howl, which in Dixon County they didn't hear that. And it was just it wasn't a bad house. I mean, for the times, it was probably it was a decent enough house. But it was a poor farm. Land was not very good. Grandpa farmed that with horses. Some of it is so steep you wonder how you could farm it at all. But they did, and so they were just living next door to the Hoghs, and just up the road about a mile. And my mother went to school in Goodwin, and of course, the Walshes frequented Goodwin too. That was a general store. That was their post office. So it was easy for them to get acquainted that way. That's how they met. And of course, Uncle Fred and Aunt Mary got married, and then through them, my parents met. In 1856, there was a man from New York by the name of Jones. At the time, there was a tremendous amount of anti-Catholic sentiment in the eastern part of the United States. Convents had been burned, and life was really difficult. So this man decided that he was going to go west and find some place where he could live in peace. So he came out to Dubuque, and he looked up the bishop of the place, Matthias Loris, who was from France. He was a survivor of the French Revolution, and he had become a priest and the bishop of Dubuque, the new territory in Dubuque. Well, they put their heads together, and they decided they would recruit some people and send them west where nobody lived so that they could live in peace. And that process took quite a while. And it so happened there was a priest from a parish called Gary Owen, which is about 20 miles west of Dubuque. He happened to be in the Chancery office at the time. So Bishop Loris says to him, "And you will lead them." So they spent about a year recruiting people. They ran ads in papers in Boston and places like that. Father Tracy went to New York, hired a hall, and he was out there preaching mainly to the Irish, that this was a plan they were going to do, and they'd come out here and they could live in peace. The Archbishop of New York didn't think much of that idea. His name was Hughes. He got up and said it was not a good idea. You'll take these people out here. They'll be lost. They may die. They'll die in the wilderness. But anyway, enough of them agreed to come that they finally got a group together. And some of them, I think, were from the Dubuque area. But they assembled in Dubuque, and then in April, one morning in April, they assembled at Gary Owen, which was Father Tracy's parish. He had built a new church there, and I've been in it. He said Mass that morning, and that afternoon, right afterwards, 18 wagons, mostly drawn by oxen. Father Tracy had horses, and the rest had oxen, because he didn't have much to carry. And they headed out for Nebraska. That was in April, and they got to Nebraska to the site on June 24th. Now, Father Tracy and his brother had been out there a year earlier looking for a site, and they found one. And they did, and it was north of where Jackson is now. Unfortunately, it was pretty close to the river, and the river ate it away. So the town didn't last too long. And they had tornadoes and everything else, and they had a lot of hardship. The first winter was very hard. They got there the 24th of June, was too late to plant a crop. And the winter was very difficult. It was a long, hard winter. I guess they had ropes tied from their dugout houses to their dugout barns, where they had to go to take care of their livestock, so they wouldn't get lost in the meantime. But anyway, they spent the winter there, and then the next spring the people spread out and they filed claims. This was before the Homestead Act. Homestead Act didn't come until 1862, but they filed claims, and the Duggans all came up to where we live, and Daniel Duggan and his wife, and they had several children, and they started a homestead, which is where Rita lives now. And then they were able to buy several more. The sons were able to buy additional land because nobody claimed it, including where we live and the farm across the road and the farm to the west of Goodwin. They were one of the first. They were one of the first families in the area, and they were a little better educated than most of the people, so they did quite well. They bought that land and lived on some of it, and then eventually sold a lot of it because like where we lived was owned by Dennis Duggan. He had no family, had no children. He had a wife, Ella, and then she was elderly, and she sold it to Martin Hogh in 1906. And then Daniel Duggan's son, John Duggan Jr., John Duggan Sr. actually, ran the store. The store was actually started by his brother. I don't remember the brother's name, but he bought it from him shortly after it was started, and they got the train to stop there. There's a story, but now John always says that wasn't true, that the railroad was always there, and a couple of men went out there periodically. They'd go out and stand on the track, get the train to stop, which maybe they did, I don't know, but John said that wasn't true. But anyway, the train started stopping, so they built a depot, and you could come and go from there. You could ship grain or livestock or anything you had, or you could bring in anything you needed to have on the train. A blacksmith shop was built, which was essential for the pioneers. People of those days, they shoe the horses and sharpen the plow lathes and any and all mechanical work. What mechanical work was done that the farmers couldn't do themselves. Of course, the machinery was primitive, so they could work on it themselves for the most part, but what was beyond them, that would be done at the blacksmith shop. Had to be very hard, miserable work, especially in the summer, standing there in front of that forge all day long with the leather apron from morning until night. But they did it, and that was the origin of Goodwin.